All right, folks. Well, thanks everybody for coming out today. We got a great discussion queued up. I'm Tom Karako, a Senior Fellow in the Defense and Security Department here at CSIS, and also direct the Missile Defense Project. Really appreciate all the folks coming out in person as well as online. Our panel today is entitled AI Diffusion and Defense Production. You know, there's quite a bit of discussion going on across town and here at CSIS on both these topics. What you might not, I think, appreciate is how much AI is being leveraged here at CSIS within the Defense and Security Department. We use foundation models to sort unstructured data and debug code. We use computer vision models to make sense of sensor data for air and missile defense, for instance. We use GPU-accelerated computing to accelerate our own modeling and simulation. And according to CSET in 2023, the Missile Defense Agency is one of the largest spenders by a fraction of its budget on grants for AI industry research. So that's kind of some of the nexus to the Missile Defense Project here. Our panel today is moderated by Masao Dahlgren, a fellow in the Missile Defense Project. Last year, he published a report entitled Defense Priorities in the Open Source AI Debate, which looked at the importance of open source or open weights AI models in DoD's supply chain. And one of the major conclusions of that paper was that the U.S. AI policy should seek to diversify the supply base of AI models in the country, if not for the economy, then at least for national defense. I'm excited to turn things over to you now, Masao, to introduce our panelists who've been obviously thinking and writing about these topics in some detail. I also want to, of course, acknowledge our friends at Meta, who sponsored today's event, and some research that we're doing on this topic. So please do feel free to send questions in online, which you can do via the event page. And over to you, Masao.
Thanks so much, Tom. In a brief housekeeping note before we get started, we will be accepting questions through the QR code and also through the event link. So please feel free to submit any questions for our panelists. We'll probably be reading some of them off near the end. We're also serving coffee outside after the event, so feel free to linger around. But before I introduce our panelists, I want to set a little context. When I wrote about these issues last summer, it felt like the United States was going to be building a high fence around its frontier AI models. The dominant narrative then was that the only safe AI would be one built by a national champion, and the only safe way to deploy AI would be through a subscription model, carefully watched and licensed by the government. China shattered this narrative. When people talk about DeepSeek moments, what stood out was how quickly folks recognized the play that Beijing was making. They're flooding the zone. They're saturating markets with extremely good, extremely cheap, often free open source AI models like Qwen or DeepSeek R1, and they're betting that most of the planet will adopt them, build on them, and rely on them. So when I think about our AI model ecosystem, I can't stop thinking about the defense supply chains my colleagues and I usually write about, and that's where I come from. You know, when you build a fighter jet or a submarine, you quickly learn how few firms exist that actually build the parts you need, that build the turbofans, that build the sealants, that build those aerospace-grade bolts that you need to make everything work. And so maybe it's better to view AI models as one of those primitives. You know, just like tanks or helicopters, when you're building AI software for the DoD, you need a wide range of good pre-trained models to use and vendors who make them. You're going to need a competitive market of vendors to maintain them. And to build a high fence, to pick and choose national champions, these things could be a significant supply chain risk to the department. So while the DoD works hard on adopting frontier AI, we need to look at these broader debates on export controls, open source, US-China, and weigh those impacts on defense supply chains. It's an angle often overlooked in these grand debates about AI policy and strategy, and it's one that our panelists here know intimately about. So I'm glad to introduce them. First, we have Keegan McBride. Dr. Keegan McBride is a course director and lecturer at the Oxford Internet Institute, an adjunct fellow at the Center for New American Security, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Foundation for American Innovation. At Oxford, he conducts research on how new and emerging disruptive technologies are transforming our understanding of the state, government, and power. Next, we have Divyansh Kaushik. Dr. Divyansh Kaushik is a vice president at Beacon Global Strategies and a pivotal resource for Congress and the administration on emerging tech policy. Before Beacon, he was an associate director at the Federation of American Scientists, writing influential papers and testifying to the Senate on technology competition with the PRC. He had his start as a machine learning researcher at CMU, where he published several peer-reviewed papers and received awards from acclaimed journals, including Empirical Methods in Natural Language Processing. And then finally, let me introduce Glenn Parham. Glenn Parham is the first and former generative AI tech lead with the Department of Defense's Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office, CDAO, speaking, of course, in his private capacity today. A former software engineer and startup founder, Glenn worked hands-on with the department as part of his Tiger team on identifying generative AI use cases in the DoD and helped deploy some game-changing AI tools to the warfighter. So thanks everyone for joining me. Let's get our Q&A started. Since a report last summer, a lot's changed on DoD AI acquisition, on open source AI, and on what China's doing. And this is for each of our panels. What's changed, and what have we learned in that time? What's different about the policy environment today? Maybe we'll start with Divyansh.
I think what's changed in my perspective, I think the biggest thing that I've seen since that report came out is the increase in armchair experts. The way the market went down the day R1 model came out, and we can go into whether there was any R&D in there or not, and my assessment is that there was no actual new R&D that went into DeepSeek's R1. There was really smart engineering, but what that showed was the importance of compute rather than the importance of lack of compute. And the assessments the takeaways that people had were, compute does not matter. Actually, no. Their advancement actually showed that compute matters even more. They had to make models, they had to make their GPUs work better. And even then, you just look at what they have been talking about since last June. Last June, DeepSeek CEO was talking to Forum 36KR and talking about how US export controls are the only thing standing between him and AGI. He reiterated that to Chinese Premier Li Qiang on January 20th in a meeting. His researchers have talked about that after DeepSeek R1's release. Right, so I think what has changed is there's been a lot of visibility and a lot of takes. It's become really hard to parse signal from noise, and that's been a big challenge for policymakers.
Keegan?
Yeah, I think in some ways, some stuff hasn't changed. There's still a significant number of folks who think that the US has an overwhelming dominance in the AI ecosystem, and we can just push a little harder or export control our way into victory. I think that's probably a mistake. The truth of the matter is, in Europe, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, this really was a sort of changing moment. I can't begin to explain what the vibe was like, for example, at the Paris AI Summit, when everyone was talking about how this represented the end of US dominance in the AI ecosystem. There was going to be this sort of unleashing of open source AI development across the world. So while maybe the debate and the conversation in the US has remained, it's changed, don't get me wrong, but in many ways it's still sort of operating within the same mental model and the same framing. Everywhere else it has changed, because there's this realization that open source AI is going to play a critical role in the future of sort of, the world's ongoing digital transformation. And while we're doing quite well, I think, on the protect side, and there's still more to do, on the promote side, there's a need to ask more questions. And how do we make sure we maintain and are relevant in this space as it continues to develop?
I would say, obviously, in my perspective, being in DoD, here in my own unofficial capacity, have to disclose that, but I've cared a lot about adoption of open source AI, how it's been applied, things like that. And I would say since post-ChatGPT, what was that, 2022 or around that, the vast majority of LLMs and frontier AI adoption has come from open source models, right? Specifically Meta. I would say they have 80, 90% of market share, and that's not just because I know they sponsored the event, so, but I would say one of the biggest policy shifts over the past couple of years was, Llama originally had this military, in terms of their use case for licensing, you couldn't use it for military use cases, right? And so the DoD was not allowed to use it, and wasn't allowed to legally use it, we'll say. And last year, I think I found out late summer, Meta ended up granting an exemption specifically for the US DoD to use Llama models. And I remember the moment I found out about that, it was a game changer for the DoD, because now across the thousands of use cases where people wanted to use these models and actually have them authorized and have their general counsel sign off on it, they no longer had that barrier and were able to move ahead. So I think that was a huge moment for Llama, for Meta, and now I think the ecosystem is going to be starting to shift a little bit, given that OpenAI and Anthropic are moving into the space. Now their models are getting accreditations in the different national security environments, which is great. I love more competition, but we definitely shouldn't discount over the past 2.5 years, the Llama models, open source, is completely dominated.
No, and I think you seize on a really good point there, competition. That's what we ultimately care about when getting supplies for the DoD, right? A competition of many vendors, many players that you can pick and choose from. And so, we talk a lot about like open source AI. I've made an argument that China is flooding the zone, right? That they are flooding the zone with competition now for US model producers. Is this the scenario we should be worrying about? What does a world without US open source AI look like? And Divyansh, you talked a little bit about our chip moats. Maybe you can get into that.
Yeah, I mean, look, yes. This is like the classic strategy that the PRC has of, they have no intention of ever making a profit in an industry. The whole intention is to get any Western competitors out. That's what we've seen in a lot of industries so far, and I think it's no surprise that they may want to pursue a similar strategy. And at the same time, what is our strategy? To your question, right? Like, you cannot, as Keegan was pointing out, you cannot reasonably expect a person who's making, I don't know, $2,000 in a year to be paying $200 a month to gain access to the most advanced model. So yes, we need to have a strategy for those markets. How do we flood the zone with our models in those markets? Separately, I would say there are actual issues with the Chinese models. There have been several independent evaluations and I'm not even talking about the propaganda piece, many independent evaluations that have found out that those models are easier to jailbreak. Those models score worse on the marginal risk tests around CBR and weapons development, on generating controlled data as well. And so I think that is a real concern that we should be concerned about. In fact, the other thing that I believe several people in DC have been talking about and are somewhat concerned about is the presence of potential sleeper agents. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar, but Anthropic had this really good paper in 2024 where they showcase how you can integrate sleeper agents into models and they cannot be fixed, at least like based on any current research, you cannot fix them by fine-tuning. So what is that, right? And how does that play into their Belt and Road strategy? And I think that is something that we definitely need to be concerned about. We do not want to be in a Huawei-like position where they came up with something and we had no alternative. And I think that's going to be one of the things that we'll potentially also see, not just in Paris that we saw, but also in the AI summit that will happen in India later this year.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think what would be really smart for the national security apparatus to do is to set some sort of guidance or policy or guardrails, whatever it should be, for adopting specifically maybe DeepSeek model or any just foreign or adversarial, maybe ITAR embargoed trained large language models, because that currently doesn't exist today. And so when DeepSeek came out a couple of months ago, you saw a number of different LLM players, I won't call them out, but roll out DeepSeek models here, there, and everywhere. And they had the authority to do so because no one was telling them no. But it's quite, in my opinion, irresponsible. So I think a CISA or an NSA should at least put out some interim something to dictate, hey, here are the risks. and don't just go wild. And please do not go to deepseek.com or whatever the website is and send sensitive information to China.
Perhaps the AI Safety Institute should be evaluating those Chinese models.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we have to be honest about the conversation, right? We can scream all day about sleeper agents and Chinese government being authoritarian, but DeepSeek came out and literally everybody was sprinting to use it. Manus came out, people were sprinting to use it. So there are some issues that are there, right? When the software or the technology becomes available, people don't have this sort of innate, ooh, I don't want to touch that. It's more like, oh, that's really cool, what have they done? And that's a mental model thing. Yeah. And at the moment, people don't understand the risk, like you say, so there's probably a role for regulation there. But the idea that we're just going to say across the board, no, you can't use that, is why we're in this situation in the first place. I mean, I do think we need restrictions. I do think we need to be tough on China. But if you look at why China is investing heavily in open source, not just in AI, but across the entirety of the tech stack, it's because on every single technology, we've been doing exactly this, which is, okay, we don't want you to use Android so that you get Harmony OS, and then we push them on chips and they start moving to RISC-V. Then they have Gitty, they're some of the biggest contributors to open source, Linux, and so on. So it's not just AI, but it's the entire sort of tech ecosystem which is being reoriented towards open source, in part because they view it as a way to counter sort of the US hegemony in this space. And when you combine that with all the conversations going on at the moment around digital sovereignty, it's a really, really volatile situation that I'm not sure people understand how dangerous it is. Some do, obviously.
I take your point on that, except like I will contest that. Yeah, people will rush to new applications. People will go to things. There's no stopping that. Case in point, TikTok. Does not matter. It does not mean that we should not try. Does not mean that there should not be a role for government in that. And if there are genuine concerns that you identify, then you should act on them.
I think my point is we should try, I agree with you, but the only way that works is if we have something which is able to match or surpass their own capabilities.
But like you saw over the last week, right, like ChatGPT just gained about 100 million new signups, right? So it's not just that, it's not a scenario where we do not have an alternative. We do have an alternative. We're not in the Huawei scenario right now.
I would say, one of my underlying theses and one of the largest gaps I saw in the DoD is that we don't have like literally any benchmarks with respect to LLM's performance and efficacy against like national security domains. And I think with respect to DeepSeek, people have like FOMO, right? They don't want to leave something on the table that could potentially be super performant. And so kind of what I would like to see happen more is more benchmarks evaluating these models across the board so that when a new model comes out from China or anywhere else, we can empirically look at it and be like, actually, it doesn't perform that much better, or maybe it performs way better, and actually like make a risk calculus there. Otherwise, like we say, it's all vibes based, right? And
That's right.
I love the vibes, but like it's national security, so we got to do better.
That's right. And that's an interesting thread I think you all are pulling on, right? These really good China, it is kind of a TikTok moment.
Yeah.
Like TikTok's really good. It's really good at doing what it does.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it spies on us. And so, do we block them out? Do we build a better product? So many ways to tackle that. But I want to move on. We should think about these flows in reverse. There's an argument that publishing AI models publicly, open sourcing AI models, will allow competitors like China to use them to catch up with the United States. We can look at like models like DeepSeek and ask those kinds of questions. As such, how do we control the outflow of information from the United States? Or is that run counter to our efforts to flood the zone ourselves and sort of capture the global commons? Maybe Keegan has an answer to that one.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of people who think the China of today is like the China of maybe 30, 40 years ago. And the fact of the matter is they're incredibly capable, competent. They have robust technological capabilities. Their economy is primed for the sort of AI moment that we're in. Structurally, they have significant advantages. It's easy to say, oh yeah, if we can blame Llama and this is why they're relevant, but it's just simply not true. They are capable. They do have these technological capabilities. We saw this play out just a couple of months ago when there was this Reuters article on the use of Llama 1 by the PLA. And it was like, oh no, the world is ending. They're running around with this completely outdated open source model to classify pictures. And then it was 2 months later that DeepSeek came out and people were like, they're significantly further ahead than what we thought. So there's a big short-term memory problem as well.
I would actually take issue with the fact that, with the assertion that people here think China is the same China 30, 40 years ago. Those people are free traders, and you don't find them anymore. But I think, I do agree with you on the open source issue, except I would also say that it's about the response is, we tend to overestimate the impact of new technologies in the near term and underestimate them in the longer term. For a technology where even the US government is struggling to identify what the true implications might be, I don't particularly blame them for having reactions the way we're seeing. To Glenn's point, we do not have proper benchmarks. We do not have somebody properly evaluating the models. I mean, there are some evaluations the US and UK AI safety security institutes have been doing, but who's evaluating the Chinese models?
Yeah, I think, there's always a discourse over, the risks of something being open source. There's like a binary, it's either open to everyone or open to like no one. And again, selfishly, I look at the experience in DoD and national security, and it's like, if the Llama models, if these open source models were not open source, like we would have had no LLMs the past 3 years. And like, I don't want to be in that. We've made a lot of progress over the past 3 years, a lot more to go, but we're just now getting OpenAI. We're just now getting Anthropic, despite a lot of different, headlines and so forth. And so when we don't have open source, I think people may discount the amount of friction of adopting technology, even when it's open source, let alone when it's proprietary and you have to go through all the right acquisitions channels.
And we underrate that, right? Yeah. Like, the amount of bureaucracy it takes to get, like, a model into the Department of Defense is no joke, right? You obtain, like, an authority to operate, you have to have a sponsor for this kind of thing. I mean, it seems really long and convoluted. And I guess this is a question for Glenn. Like, what do you see moving forward in this space? How do we make it easier for the DoD to adopt, advanced AI models? Why is it so hard?
I think, well, one of the main issues has been the lack of compute in the right areas. So you'll see a lot of talk publicly. They'll be like, oh, we're spending all this money on these supercomputing clusters. And I'm like, great, where is it? Is that accessible on the different DoD networks? Oh, no, it's not. It's somewhere else. Respectfully, that's not helpful. And so as a result of that, one of the biggest problems has been we can't, at the different impact levels, we're not able to literally run inference. I've had discussions where they're like, we don't have GPUs, is that a problem? And I'm like, yeah, it's kind of not going to work out. So I would say a lack of compute, one. But I also say there's kind of uncharted territory with respect to data rights. So when it comes to acquisitions, there's all these federal acquisition regulations that regulate how we're able to buy stuff. And there's been a lot of mishaps across the government where there have been instances where we take government data, then we fine tune it with different vendors and so forth, and then the vendors own that model and they're like, oh, well, we're not gonna let you take those model weights and apply it in different areas. You're gonna have to rebuy the same thing over and over. And that's been a massive headache across the whole national security world. So I think one of my recommendations was to amend and clarify in these federal acquisition regulations data governance and data rights. Where does government's ownership stop and start, so that we run into less vendor lock-in and things like that.
Well, I don't want to nerd out here,
Sorry.
but this has been the hottest topic in defense hardware for the longest time, right? Mm-hmm. Modular open systems architectures, right? This notion that your tank or your plane shouldn't be like a printer, where you have to buy the same cartridges from the same vendor that has the same software. And so when we're thinking about maintaining AI models, not just acquiring an AI model, but retraining it over time, how do you navigate those kinds of data rights challenges? How do we ensure DoD AI systems are open and modular, where somebody else can work on them even though you buy them from somebody? Is that an ecosystem level problem, or is that a regulation problem?
I would say one thing that I've seen that's been a positive over the past couple of years is people have been abiding by like the OpenAI API schema, which sounds kind of trivial, but
Not China.
it's and it's made it much easier to interoperate, switch LLMs as new LLMs come online in different environments. It's like, great, we can switch over to that. So that's been a huge plus, and that's kind of been unexpected. But yeah, to your point, I think we do need to be a little bit more actually spell out best practices when it comes to acquisition. Because remember, the people buying these tools, they don't have technical expertise. And so they don't know what they don't know. So I think we should have some sort of playbook or best practices to kind of educate acquisitions professionals.
Actually, this reminds me of a question for Keegan. You know, you've studied a lot of foreign governments and how they promote technologies and do digital governance. Are there any learnings we could have maybe from Estonia or elsewhere on digital governance, on building these kinds of best practices?
I mean, everybody's still figuring it out. Like, you can go to any government anywhere in Europe, North America, and say, how's procurement working out? And they'll all have lists and lists and lists of problems and issues. There are some countries that are further than others on the sort of like AI and government adoption front, Singapore being one, Estonia being one. The UK is trying to do more in this space with the new Digital Government Blueprint, the new AI Opportunities Act. But the other side of this is, right, when you're in a political position, you have a limited budget, and you have to go and convince your voters that, oh, instead of, I don't know, fixing potholes, we need to spend $150 million revitalizing our obscure information system so that, you know, it's more sort of modern, you know, updating it from the 1980s, and we can now do some data science on it. That's a really hard sell when there's a whole lot of other things you could be spending money on. And I mean, I do think this is going to be sort of changing the conversation a little bit. It's something that the US and the West more broadly is going to have to come to grips with, which I think China does have some structural advantages that we just won't be able to meet, right? They will do things with data that we aren't and won't be able to do. There will be things that are happening on the energy front that we won't be able to do. And that's going to be true across a whole bunch of domains. And how we navigate that, I think, is going to be increasingly tricky.
I'm actually curious, right? We talk about these compute requirements for inference, within the government. It strikes me that that's going to get a lot harder with these new reasoning models, right? The old days with like the GPT-4s, it's just you run it in one shot and you get the chatbot response back. But now, that inference is running 100 times more. How do we meet that growing demand for chips within the government? Maybe Divyansh or Keegan, you have some thoughts on that.
Within the government?
Well, I guess anybody
Well,
can take it.
I mean, there are countries who are thinking about, from a sort of forecasting perspective, what will the future of government look like as AI continues to develop? And then you have these really interesting conversations of if the government is going to be AI-powered and everyone has their own sort of AI agent, is it up to the government to build their own sort of government AI that's going to be interfacing with citizens to provide services, or do you create a marketplace where somebody can have like an Anthropic chatbot or an OpenAI chatbot and then is interfacing with the government backend? So I have heard more and more this idea of moving more of the compute and the inference side to the private sector, but that's sort of context specific. But these are the conversations that people are having at the moment, and countries are looking for examples of how to do it.
I think inference compute is one of the most underrated the conversation on inference compute needs to be happening more. The importance of it. In fact, many people when they were talking about, oh look how DeepSeek just showed, oh you don't need compute. Well, Bank of China the next day was investing $137 billion in building compute capacity in China. Chinese banks have been pouring more money ever since to invest more compute capacity in China. Like the point is, say you build, Anthropic projects to have like a 5 gigawatt frontier model by 2027. Well, say you build one and it replicates Einstein's brain, hypothetically. It is the true ASI, AGI, whatever we are talking about. Do you want 100 copies of it, or do you want 1 million copies of it deployed? That's the ball game on inference, and that's, I think, one of the biggest conversations that we need to be having on the diffusion of this technology, both here at home, abroad, and slowing down or preventing access to this technology, to the Chinese for a time. You're not going to like fully prevent them the access. They're going to catch up over time. But these policies are about time and space. While we grow our lead and get to the next generation. So I think, to your point, this is going to be the conversation every single person will be having over the next 6 months.
Yeah, I would add to that. My recommendation to government is that the government has a hard time efficiently allocating, especially compute resources. And so my recommendation is to be product driven and let whatever product is rolled out that integrates LLMs have that drive, whatever the compute requirement is. It's impossible for me to just like, hypothesize and predict exactly how many H100s need to be at on, this impact level and so forth. But if we have user demand, and we've seen success with that across the DoD, that it can more efficiently map to what actual compute resources we need to invest.
So there's like this grand ecosystem level problem, right, with inference just generally. And then there's this very narrow government focused problem on how do you get good inference and good compute in the government. But I want to switch gears a little bit. How rapidly is China adopting frontier AI in national security applications? How do you rate their competitiveness in these domains? This is an open question for Keegan or Divyansh.
I mean, I'll just say, based on what's public reporting, I'm not going to get into anything else. They are adopting very heavily, and they have, a lack of guardrails that where we have red lines, and for good reason we have those red lines. The U.S. government tried to have a direct conversation with the Chinese government last year to get a commitment on that the Chinese will not integrate AI and nuclear command and control, and the Chinese would not commit to that. The PRC did not commit to not integrating AI and nuclear command and control. That will tell you just how they are viewing, where we want to make sure that we are integrating it responsibly. We spearheaded the political declaration that the State Department worked on AI and its military use. And I think that is the way that we're trying to go with it. And I'm sure Glenn can comment more on how the US is going to go. But the Chinese, the PLA, we have to be very realistic. They have an explicit civil-military fusion strategy. Anything that is done for civilian research is used for military. They have the national security law, the national intelligence law, that compels any individual or organization in the PRC to work for the government for its national security or intelligence objectives. And so you have to be very realistic that whatever is happening from a commercial standpoint there is benefiting the military.
Yeah, I mean, also on the responsible AI and autonomous weapons, I think in South Korea they didn't sign on.
Yeah.
And if you look at what China's doing, they're, I would say, quite far ahead on the data infrastructure side. What they're doing in terms of centralizing data standardization, metadata, interoperability, running sort of data labeling camps. If you think about the size of the population and how much data they're generating, the fact that their economy and society is already fairly digital and integrated, the amount of data they generate is going to grow exponentially. So I think there are significant advantages that they have in that space, and they're absolutely playing them.
And they also, one of the key parts of BR, Belt and Road Initiative, is that they collect data from all those countries that they go in. They have access to all that data as well. And so, but one of the things that Keegan was pointing out, that the Chinese will be able to build, they'll have data advantages, they'll have energy advantages. What they don't have advantage over right now is compute. And that's been where we are trying, the US government has tried to make sure that we have some time and space over there. Otherwise, the PRC has been adding more power to its grid than the United States has added in the last decade. They've been adding more every year or two, right? So they could have easily gotten there if you just look at the scaling laws of frontier models, if not for the US government's strategy on making sure that they don't have access to a computing ecosystem the way we do.
And when we talk about,
No comment.
well, That's funny you bring up data, right? I mean, there's two pathways, I guess, to scaling traditionally, right? You use more compute or you use more data. And you know, it's a number of high-profile figures have talked about how we're increasingly bottlenecked in the U.S. by data, right? There's only so much of the internet you can mine. I guess an open question, maybe to the panel, is this somewhere where closed societies have an advantage over us? We can't access their data, but they can mine us for all the data we need. You know, how do we make sure that Americans' data rights are respected by other countries like China?
Good question.
Not going to touch that.
I think. I mean, for a start, we could start believing in digital trade. You know, I think hot take, but this is just my personal take. I think the last administration did not do a good enough job at all on digital trade policies, and I think the current administration has at least said that they will be working more on that. So I think if you look, there are a lot of levers that you can pull if you engage in digital trade negotiations with other countries.
Are there any levers that we should be pulling that are exciting to everybody?
I mean, there has been a lot of public reporting. I see where you're going on this. There was some public reporting that perhaps, maybe we should ban DeepSeek in the U.S. or, you know, because it's collecting American data, or, you know, the app, whatnot, right? One of the reasons behind TikTok was that too. There are authorities that the U.S. government has that it can exercise on that. You know, the ICTS has authorities under IEPA. ICTS at the Bureau of Industry and Security has authorities under IEPA that it can use if it wanted to block some of these models or the model weights from being deployed. And I'm not saying whether they should or should not, but they have the authorities.
I think, you know, it would be really compelling if we could even measure, you know, the trade of data that we had between the US and China. It strikes me that that's kind of an unregulated field, right? We have flows going in and we have flows coming out. I wonder if there's anywhere in the government that measures those total flow.
There's some statistics on like cross-border data flows and stuff like that, and China's role in this ecosystem is increased every year for a while now and is growing rapidly.
That's a trade imbalance I wonder if we'll be hearing about today. But let's switch gears a little bit on data, right? We can talk about data in China and the US's data more broadly, but when it comes to the DoD specifically, what are some data challenges that the warfighter faces, that developers face in building tools for defense applications?
You know, the data is really siloed and fragmented, and part of that's by design. We don't want everyone having access to everyone else's data all the time, but cut to experiences of me of like knocking on doors in the Pentagon, like, please give me access to your SharePoint or share drive. But I would say with respect to like basically data interoperability, this actually all goes back to acquisitions, which I keep talking about, which is, and a lot of times, these vendors have no obligation, because of how the contracts are crafted, to give the government back like its own data. So creating these open, not open AI, open APIs for other vendors to come compete and so forth is not in the underlying contracts. And so as a result of that, we have vendor lock-in. We're not getting, you know, the best, most performant tools that these vendors can actually build around. And so my former employer, they did a lot of work around that. They called that like open dagger, this idea that all kind of acquisitions contracts going into the future must mandate kind of this interoperability for these companies to do. It's trickling down. The DoD is a large place, but it's something that needs to be at the forefront of everyone's minds.
I want to also like build on that. I think you know, when we talk about national security, we talk about DoD, but the Department of Energy has a lot of data at its national labs, including NNSA labs. If you wanted to do a lot of AI for national security, you would tap the Department of Energy, you would tap the national labs expertise, the scientists there, the data there, they have the hardest problems that they're working on. Put the models to use over there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think this kind of all goes back to how incredibly fragmented things were, like with respect to the Department of Energy specifically. We try to work with them. They have massive GPU computing clusters, which is very attractive. But again, those weren't on the right networks and so forth that people use in the DoD and elsewhere. And so I think there needs to be more work done on that, that linkage or connection layer in order for us to actually use those incredibly resource intensive clusters and everything that already exists. And we already paid for it, right? So might as well use it.
When this always seems to happen, right? Like you always buy the thing first and then you stitch it together later.
Yeah.
After the fact. We wrote a report on satellite constellations a while back, and it was the same story. You put the satellites in orbit and you figure out how to get the data down much later on. Yeah. So I guess that's a common problem. But I'm curious about success stories. Were there any examples you can think of that are a good model for data sharing within the US government, within the DoD?
I can only think of bad ones. But what I will say is, I think there have been a number of almost like frameworks or these constructs for better data interoperability and data sharing, which I think are super promising. Because up until this point, it's literally zipping up data, trying to email it to different people, and it's really not pretty. I think the department has learned a lot in terms of what doesn't work. Massive data lakes where everyone throws in their data into one place doesn't work. It's really expensive, and we found that. So I think what has worked and the success stories that are starting to emerge are where they shift that onus back to the vendors to open up their, whether literally APIs into their databases and so forth in a secure manner. And so maybe let's check back in a year and see how much progress they've made.
For me, it's fun to watch this because the AI crowd is sort of speed running, discovering what people in digital government have been working on for close to 20, 30, 40 years at this point. I mean, you can go back to the 2008 sort of Obama memoranda on open data, right? We've had these conversations like, oh, government data should be open, it should be interoperable, we should have machine readable code, and so on. And this is what they have in Europe, right? You have the European Interoperability Reference Architecture, you have the European Interoperability Framework, they have cross-border exchange of data. So, if you're in Finland and your doctor writes you a prescription and you fly to Portugal and you need it, the Portuguese pharmacy can actually query the prescription from Finland. They're doing that at the sort of block level. And there are other examples, and there are different approaches to this. So a while back, I did a sort of 20-country cross-comparative study on data exchange and interoperability, and what you see actually is the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or UK are significantly behind others, in part due to a lot of the concerns around data privacy, fears around surveillance, stuff like that, which isn't to say that we should just get rid of all of that, but it is something that is sort of unique to our own administrative history and context. And then there are questions on how do you build this? And so you could look at the data storage side. You want to have it centralized or decentralized. So South Korea has centralized government data storage in 2 different data centers. And then centralized data exchange as well, where if you want data, you just sort of hit the relevant server. But increasingly you see this movement towards decentralized data storage, decentralized data exchange. Estonia is one example of how this is done. Netherlands has something there. Switzerland has something like that, where you have different agencies who have their own data. You open it up via an API. You have the government mandate that new digital government systems need to be interoperable by default, and you can do the permissioning and everything else. So there are plenty of examples of how to do this, but it's easier to just, ignore them.
It's funny that we're talking about this now, and 2 years ago, the G20 was focused on, a lot of it was focused on digital public infrastructure, right? The G20 that happened in India. And in fact, you travel to a lot of the developing countries or middle countries, you'll find that the focus is mainly on digital public infrastructure. They're not talking about developing the frontier model. They're talking about how to provide the services to their citizens. And not just financial transactions, but government services. Yeah. And they view their digital infrastructure as a common good that that private sector can then build on top of and commercialize it, make money off of. But building that underlying ecosystem, and I think they're also like looking at exporting that model, whether it's Estonia looking to export its model or India looking to export its model. And I think that is something that perhaps the G7 economies can learn a lot from.
I just wanted to pick up on this because I think it's a really important point, which is as we are here in the US having debates around sort of more control, things like that, we've basically ceded many countries to India and China and what they're doing on digital public infrastructure. And we have let the past couple of years, I think, pass us by, and I think it's going to be increasingly important to see us do more in this space, particularly as conversations around open source AI, open source AI as a digital public good, and these sorts of conversations are happening. It's really important to be in the ring now and making sure that the US is represented in these conversations.
What do we do about that? Like, there is a
seriously.
huge, what?
Take it seriously.
Well, I suppose we're in the business of doing that now.
I might suggest, I think that I came to the DoD, the Pentagon, I joined the Defense Digital Service, when the whole mandate of all the digital services that spun off like about a decade ago or something like that. It was to get technical minds into the government, but not just on like necessarily the research side, which is super important, but kind of sprawled across the government in a lot of these kind of non-technical positions that have previously existed. And so I think what it's really come down to is being able to have the technical foresight to include that data rights clause in the acquisitions contract or whatever it may be. You need technical minds in the government. Like, sorry, there's really no other way around it. Not like vendors or contractors. You need like government, GS or GG, like civilians as that are in these positions of power to make decisions. And I think over the past couple of years, they've done a lot of work to make it a little easier to attract that talent, but it's still really, really hard. And I think that like none of this is going to work unless we have those technical minds like driving decisions.
I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but just a note for the audience, we have about 13 minutes left. So if you have any questions you'd like to submit, they'll come up to my magic iPad. Please go to the event site and feel free to submit them. You guys are shy today. But let's move forward. We talk about the competitive landscape for AI models, right? How many vendors are available for the Department of Defense narrowly, and then more broadly, how competitive are we, in this world? When you look forward into the next 5 years, what do you think this competitive landscape is going to look like? Is AI like a big iron thing? Is there going to be consolidation in this industry? And if so, how much? Maybe this is a question for Keegan.
I mean, the CMA in the UK has some really good reporting on the sort of market structure. Like, at the end of the day, it's basically every model provider. It's either Amazon or Google or Microsoft in a trench coat. So, I mean, there are people who are winning. And I think that trend's going to continue.
Yeah, I mean, just look at, if the scaling laws continue, the frontier models are just going to become harder and harder to train because they will need a lot more energy, a lot more compute. Say, if you want to train a 5 gigawatt model in 2027, I can name maybe 7 companies that can do that in the world. And so I think that trend is going to be there. What happens is like, who's building on top of that?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think that will be key. But separately, I do also believe that sometimes on, maybe the performance difference between the best performing model and the second best performing model is just like, say, 3 to 5% on some benchmark. It does not matter if the second best performing model is more integrated in your ecosystem across the industry. It's acting as a catalyst, providing those economic gains. Doesn't matter if you're getting AGI or ASI, like even if you're getting like halfway there, right? Like that's a big boost. And I think a lot of people, a lot of companies can do a lot of that, even if they perhaps won't be able to develop or train, 5 gigawatt frontier models.
Yeah, I mean, being in government, like you see how it's not always the best product that wins out. It's the one that's been that, what is it called, the system of record or whatever, that's kind of been the incumbent. And I think largely I want to agree that we'll see more consolidation or fewer players who have more and more resources to build better and better models. But then I always look at like, the story of an OpenAI, which, was the underdog for so long and then came along and, put what made Google come out to play or whatever the quote is. And I think that there's a lot of these, like with AI research going on, different, maybe even more efficient architectures, state-space models, diffusion. I know a lot of great work coming out with like end-to-end encryption of large language models, homomorphic stuff. Like, I think that there's a non-zero chance that like any one of those players could come in and eat the others, albeit a low chance, and the probability that like, one of these main AI labs that exist today might just eat them up or like, send them an offer letter with a total comp that's just exorbitantly high. But I don't know. I still think that there's a chance that, as these AI labs grow and, the velocity maybe slows down, there's room for other players to compete.
Well, right on that. Oh.
No, I was just going to say on the ecosystem, this is what China's betting on. They know, at least at the moment, they're not going to probably beat OpenAI, but what they can do is leverage Belt and Road Initiative, Digital Silk Road, the inroads that they're building across Southeast Asia, across Africa, going to countries that the labs are currently ignoring because the economic incentives don't make sense. Then you have the, either Quen or DeepSeek or something else. You wake up in a couple of months and you go, uh-oh. You have, a significant portion of the world's population running on Chinese open source. How do you convince them then to switch to, a closed source American solution when you have all of the wrappers and everything else that are being on top of this?
There's a whole stack, right? There's a whole platform. I mean, I have an iPhone, right? And you have iMessage, and you get the blue text bubble. Are we going to be the green? Are we going to be the green text message in the world? That's a real question, right? So I'm, or you can get the green bubble. Well, I'm getting some audience questions in now. The scolding worked. And so I have one for Glenn. This is from Michael Kenny at the Space Force. Could you please speculate on use cases LLMs have for DoD applications? Are there any ones that stick out to you?
Ooh, so, we had I will gladly speculate. We had a task force. It was called Task Force Lima. Again, I'm here in my unofficial capacity, but just Google it. And we have a report on that and our findings about where LLMs can be maybe of use in different like DoD domains. One thing I found, just broadly speaking, is we've done a lot of experimentation with LLMs to frankly push paperwork, which sounds really lame, but when you realize that the DoD really loves paperwork, like it really loves paperwork, and monitoring how much more quickly analysts can be and more productive. One thing that I can't talk about is like how we use these to do like cyber defense operations, right? How we could use LLMs to help auto draft different incident reports and so forth. That was something that it took a long time working with the analysts who were in the Security Operations Center, understanding what that balance of like, how much context should the LLM be exposed to, where in the workflow should the LLM be injected into. But I think what was interesting about that use case is it was surprisingly much more hands-on and a much more iterative process than just like, all right, have this LLM suck up all your network data and have it, generate some incidents. So yeah, check out the task force. I don't know if there's a camera, but check out just Google search Task Force Lima, and hopefully that can clear some things up.
Well, that's great. We're getting another question in from Katerina Wojtenko with Palace Advisors. And this is really compelling. She says that out of our STEM workforce, only 1 in 12 higher education entrants successfully graduate with a STEM degree. Are there conversations being held on how to promote domestic STEM education or attract foreign talent? Maybe this is a question that I think you know a lot about.
I think one thing we could do is not cut the budget for the National Science Foundation. But it seems like that's out of the question, so let's talk what can we do. The NSF has a Missing Millions program where it goes into, that program specifically targets communities that where people have not particularly gone into STEM, or the graduation rates have not been so high. And I think that is an important program. Those kinds of programs need to continue. The fellowships, one of the things, like all the LLMs that we're building today, none of those would have been possible without 2 grants. Like, sure, a lot of other grants, but like 2 key grants that the National Science Foundation made. 1970s and 80s, the National Science Foundation, during the AI winter, funded Jeff Hinton's work when nobody was funding AI research on neural networks because they were seen as waste and fraud. Because, everybody had agreed, let's just, genetic modeling or logic programs will be the way to go. They funded that work. They also funded Andrew Barto, who's the father of reinforcement learning, along with his advisor, Rich Sutton, back in the day. But Andrew was a PhD student at University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and his PhD was funded by the National Science Foundation to work on reinforcement learning, which was not even a thing at the time. So the 2 of those things taken together are like the underlying concepts for the LLMs that you see today. None of that would have happened. So I think we need to focus a lot on basic science research, and that brings more talent in. To the foreign talent part, I mean, look, we have not, just to give you some numbers, 60% of the computer science PhDs that are international students. About 50% of 50% of all STEM PhDs are international students. CSIS just released a new report today that international student enrollments in the United States dropped 11% between March 2023 and March 2024. That's not talking about the current administration. That's between March 2023 and 2024. And so I think there are some issues that we need to look at, right? Because you need to be providing people predictability and certainty. If you want to attract and retain them, you can't just be like, come here, wait for, what the current green card backlog for a PhD student from, say, India or China or Philippines is 100 years. They will die. So, what is the predictability and certainty that we are offering if we want that talent here? China produces twice as many STEM PhDs, twice as many STEM masters, 4 times as many STEM bachelors than the United States. We cannot compete based on just domestic STEM talent alone. We need to tap the rest of the world, a whole team. And I think that will require a lot more. Congress came close during the CHIPS negotiations to fix that issue somewhat. And I think there's been a lot of, Senator Rounds has a bill on this. In fact, I believe the only bipartisan bill right now in the Senate that would address this issue. Senator Young has been talking about this. There's bipartisan recognition. But at the end of the day, it's not a priority.
Well,
Like, if your CEOs are not calling members of Congress daily, that's how CHIPS got done. Because CEOs were calling daily members of Congress. If CEOs are not calling about something, that's not a priority.
well, this kind of leads us, there's so many great questions we have right in before the buzzer, so I feel frustrated I can't. So sorry to Adam Tierer, Sidney Freeberg, Brian Gay, and all of the rest of you who submitted. I want to end with a lightning round. We often talk about moats in the startup world, right? The killer feature that keeps you ahead of competitors. My question to you all is, what's America's moat?
Probably, maybe I have the least controversial take, is I think it's our talent. To your point, I think a lot of great talent either is in America with respect to AI and they want to stay here, or a lot of folks externally want to come here. And I think seeing in the DoD, we have people from all over the world who come work there. They are the ones who actually get stuff done. And I think that is one of the most unique advantages of this country.
I think our scientific ecosystem, the way industry works with academia, hand in hand, I think academia focusing a lot on basic research, industry doing a lot of applied research, and the whole ecosystem that has created is our moat, which, you look at any Chinese 5-year plan, they talk about replicating that. The last 3 5-year plans that the PRC has put out, they explicitly talk about replicating the US ecosystem on basic and applied research.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would also sort of agree that the ecosystem that we have here, the capital we're able to mobilize, this sort of interest in innovation and the reward that you get for leading in innovation is something that we do very well here. These other things like, we have the biggest model and we're always going to have the biggest model. That moat doesn't, it does for maybe 2-3 months, but like that's a temporary thing. So a lot of the moat people thought we had, I would say we don't have anymore, but yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what my moat is. My moat are these three lovely guys out here. My moat is all of you in the audience. Thank you guys so much. We have to wrap it up. So give them a round of applause, please.